You're not going to believe what happened the day I realized HOA Karen wanted my boat more than her own sanity. Before we dive in, tell me which country you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories just like this one. The story begins on a warm afternoon when the lake was quiet and the air carried that shark mix of sunscreen, pine, and gasoline from weekend fishing boats. I had just finished a slow cruise across the water, letting the engine idle as I docked near my cabin. The boat wasn't anything outrageous, a simple, sturdy 12-footer with an old motor that rattled like it had a cough. But it got me across the water and held more memories than any new model ever could. It belonged to my father first, then to me, and it had become a steady companion in a neighborhood where nothing stayed peaceful for long. The HOA claimed their main purpose was to protect property values. If you listened to them long enough, you'd think every blade of grass held the fate of the community. But to me and most of my neighbors, the real issue wasn't the rules. It was Karen. She wasn't the only board member, but she was the only one who behaved like she'd been personally appointed by the universe to enforce every regulation with the intensity of a tax auditor. The friction started the morning she marched down the gravel road toward my cabin, her visor tilted like a shield and a clipboard clutched against her chest. She inspected my boat from 10 steps away, squinting as if the sunlight itself was breaking HOA law. I could see her lips forming silent judgments even before she snapped a photo of the hull and strutted off. I knew what that meant. Karen didn't take photos unless she planned to escalate something. Later that evening, I found a violation notice taped to my cabin door. It fluttered in the breeze like a warning flag. According to the letter, my boat was improperly stored, aesthetic disruptive, and in conflict with community standards. The problem was the HOA bylaws didn't mention boats at all. They had plenty to say about exterior paint colors, fence height, and roadside trees, but nothing about vessels parked on private docks. The whole thing felt manufactured, like she needed a new target and my boat had been the unlucky pick. I ignored the notice. I had lived near unpredictable water my whole life. You learn not to overreact to first waves. But Karen didn't let things go. She pressed until something snapped. 2 days later, she marched back with 2 other board members trailing behind her carrying papers and forced smiles. They stood on the dock like a committee ready to confiscate a toddler's toy. Karen pointed at my boat and rattled through a rehearsed list of imagined violations. The others nodded along, too polite or too intimidated to question her. When she finished, she announced the boat had to be relocated, off the lake entirely, by the end of the week. There was only one problem. I wasn't planning on moving it. This was my dock, my cabin, my land, and my boat. I kept everything in good shape. I didn't block anyone. I didn't create eyesores. Karen just wanted control. That night, as the water settled into its quiet rhythm, I sat on the edge of the dock and let the situation churn in my mind. She wasn't going to stop, not after a small win. If I caved once, she'd keep inventing rules. I needed a different angle, one that didn't involve shouting or pointless meetings, one that used her own obsession against her. So I came up with a plan. It wasn't complicated, it wasn't confrontational, it was patient, and it relied entirely on how predictable Karen was. She had a habit of stalking around the lake early in the morning, looking for anything out of place. She always wanted evidence in her hands, photos, videos, proof she could take to the board. She didn't just enforce rules, she hunted them. If Karen wanted my boat gone, then she'd have to come take it. I knew she would try eventually. She couldn't resist the idea of fixing something. All I had to do was prepare for the moment she overstepped. For the next week, I made subtle adjustments. I positioned the boat just so, I tightened ropes, shifted the trailer, and cleared a small area where the ground dipped. I checked the cameras around my cabin, making sure all angles were covered. I didn't want anything dramatic, just a clean record of exactly what happened when the time came. It didn't take long. Word spread around the neighborhood that Karen was bragging about a major violation she was close to shutting down. People joked about it, guessing which unlucky neighbor she was targeting next. None of them knew she had set her eyes on the boat. None of them knew she was about to walk into a situation she would never recover from. On the 8th morning, thick fog drifted across the lake, turning everything quiet and slow. I woke early and waited inside the cabin, coffee in hand, listening to the soft slap of water against the dock. When her footsteps crept down the gravel road, I didn't move. I just watched from the window as she approached with the same determined walk she used when she believed she was doing important HOA business. She scanned the boat, checked her clipboard, then looked around to make sure no one else was watching. Then she stepped on my dock. She didn't know the cameras were recording. She didn't know the ground near the trailer was softer than usual. She didn't know she was walking into the moment I had been waiting for since the first notice appeared on my door. What happened next would set off the biggest meltdown our neighborhood had ever seen. And it all started because she couldn't resist touching something that didn't belong to her. The morning after the so-called inspection turned into the talk of the marina. People walked the dock slower than usual, pausing just long enough to glance up the empty slip where the boat had been. The tide was low, the gulls were loud, and for a moment the whole place felt staged, like the calm before someone finally flipped the lights on and revealed what had really been going on. I stayed quiet, letting the tension build on its own. It didn't take long for stories to spread, each one more dramatic than the last. Some claimed Karen had paid a tow crew under the table. Others whispered she'd planned the grab weeks earlier and had been bragging about her victory in private HOA group chats. What none of them knew was that the boat she took wasn't the boat she thought it was. Her expression the night before had been full of triumph, but it would fade fast when she realized how badly she miscalculated. I spent the morning checking the cameras I had hidden along the shoreline. They were placed to catch anyone creeping near the property, and every angle confirmed the night's events perfectly. Her crew had struggled, argued, and cursed during the loading process. None of them noticed the small details that would matter later. The chipped paint, the mismatched screws, the fact that the interior had been gutted for weeks. It was a decoy, sitting there for this exact reason. I had learned from experience that HOA enforcers like Karen weren't reckless by accident. They were reckless because they assumed no one would ever challenge them. They counted on authority, on loud confidence, on the idea that most residents hated confrontation. But this time, she walked into something she couldn't spin or bully her way through. By noon, HOA board members started calling me to discuss the incident. Their voices were flat, careful, as if they were reading from a script. They told me they were gathering information, that the board would meet privately, that they expected full cooperation. It was predictable. I gave them nothing. Instead, I let them squirm while I visited a friend who owned the tow yard. He was already waiting for me when I arrived, leaning against the fence with a grin. He had seen everything the night before and understood why I looked so calm. He walked me to the back, where the decoy boat was stored, resting crookedly like a beached whale. Up close, the damage was clearer. Karen's crew had scraped the hull, cracked a rail, and nearly snapped a support beam. Even if she claimed authority, she had no legal right to seize anything, much less damage it. All I had to do now was wait for the moment she realized what she actually stole. I positioned myself near the yard office, pretending to check messages while the quiet anticipation worked its way through the air. It didn't take long. A black SUV pulled in, stopping too fast, rocking slightly as the brakes squealed. The door slammed. Karen marched out with the same stiff, entitled posture she always had, only this time there was something new under it. Panic.
She scanned the lot, looking for someone to blame the moment she opened her mouth, but the tow yard owner simply pointed her to the boat. Watching her react from a distance was almost surreal. She circled the decoy, steps uneven, gestures sharp and frantic. She kept lifting her hands like she wanted to shout at someone but couldn't figure out which part of the situation deserved her rage first. It was clear the truth hit her hard. She had not taken my prized boat. She had taken the old shell I kept for storage and maintenance training. It wasn't seaworthy. It wasn't insured. It wasn't worth anything beyond the trap I designed it for. Her next move was predictable. She tried to order the tow yard crew to move the boat again, insisting she needed to correct the mix-up. But the owner refused, reminding her that nothing could be moved without the signatures of the rightful owner. She was stuck, surrounded by witnesses, and every second made her look worse. I waited until she turned toward her SUV before I walked out. She froze when she saw me, her shoulders tightening like a spring pulled too far. The tow yard crew looked between us, sensing more drama about to unfold. The choice she made next revealed everything about her. She didn't apologize. She didn't back down. Instead, she straightened her jacket, pulled out her phone, and started recording the damage on the decoy boat as if it were evidence against me. She moved around it with shaky determination, narrating her version of events to a camera that wasn't going to save her. Desperation made her sloppy. Her words contradicted each other. Her tone cracked. She didn't realize that documenting stolen property only made her situation worse. I walked past her without speaking, running my hand along the railing of the decoy. The scratches told a clear story of careless handling and rushed loading. The cameras at my home had already captured the theft. The tow yard's own cameras caught the unloading, and now she was filming the damage herself, adding her own timestamp to the mess she created. The trap was complete. The tow yard owner asked if I wanted the boat moved back home or kept there while the situation unfolded. I told him to leave it exactly where it was. Karen overheard that and spun toward me, trying to hold her composure, but the cracks were visible now. She paced around the lot, each step faster than the last, running out of ways to shift the blame. She understood that she had crossed the line she couldn't erase. When she finally got back into her SUV, she sat there for a long moment with both hands on the wheel. I could see the weight of what she'd done pressing down on her. The HOA could not shield her from this. The board could not spin it. She wasn't acting under any official authority. She was a resident who stole property, damaged it, transported it across town, and recorded the evidence herself. She drove off with the same speed she arrived, tires kicking up dust behind her. The tow yard workers watched the SUV disappear, shaking their heads. I stayed behind for a few minutes, letting the tension settle before leaving. By the time I reached home, messages from neighbors were piling up again. Rumors spread quickly. People suspected Karen. They sensed something big was coming. And it was. The real storm hadn't even started yet.
The sun drifted low over the marina that evening, spreading a warm haze across the water while the neighborhood buzzed with small weekend routines. The quiet was deceptive, because beneath it, something had shifted. Ever since Karen strutted away from the dock with fake triumph, believing she had finally cornered a boat owner she wanted gone, the air held a different charge. The story raced through the community faster than morning gossip. Some neighbors acted nervous, some annoyed, and some eager to see how far she would take things this time. But everyone sensed that Karen's obsession with the boat had moved into a place she couldn't walk back from. The narrator now turns to the main character's perspective, anchoring the build-up. The boat sat exactly where he wanted it, registered correctly, documented perfectly, and equipped with more cameras than Karen could imagine. Inside its small cabin, each device blinked quietly, cataloging every angle. The boat itself wasn't valuable, and it wasn't even one he used often. But what mattered was that it made Karen greedy. She wanted it gone, wanted to feel powerful, wanted to prove she controlled the marina. But she didn't know she had stepped straight into a layered, patient trap.
Evening drifted toward night, and with it came the small signals that Karen was gearing up for another stunt. The narrator describes how her blinds shifted at odd intervals, how her porch light flicked on early, how she paced in the narrow strip of walkway like someone preparing for a mission she believed would crown her queen of the HOA. Her confidence had inflated after taking the boat. Even though she hadn't actually done so, she simply believed she had. That belief alone made her bold enough to try again. Across the neighborhood, people settled into their routines. A couple walked their dog near the marina entrance. A teenager skateboarded past the lake path. A few neighbors watered plants or closed garage doors. Normal movement wrapped around the dock, giving Karen the illusion that no one was paying attention. In truth, everyone was paying attention, because she had spent years making sure the entire community lived in fear of crossing her. Now, the same community was ready to watch her fall. As the narrator continues, the scene shifts to the main character standing inside his darkened cabin overlooking the dock. He waited without tension, leaning against the frame while his phone displayed a grid of camera feeds. Each camera caught shadows stretching across the water as night thickened. The dock lights added sharp reflections that made the boat look almost staged. And in a way, it was. Hours passed quietly. Eventually, the calm broke when Karen stepped outside, dressed in all black, which she probably thought made her look like a covert operative. In reality, it made her look like someone trying to sneak across a well-lit dock under cameras she had conveniently forgotten existed. Her movements were slow but clumsy. She clutched a clipboard and a thick folder filled with HOA papers that she believed gave her power. She also carried a flashlight she kept turning on and off, maybe to signal someone or maybe just to feel official. The narrator keeps the tone steady, describing the absurd seriousness she gave herself. She tiptoed along the path, glancing over her shoulder even though the only person around was the neighborhood cat staring at her from a railing. She reached the boat, circled it twice, and then pulled out her phone to take pictures. She photographed the hull, the registration sticker, the rope knot, and even a random bird feather stuck to the windshield. She acted like a detective, preparing evidence for a grand case. Then came the moment everything shifted. Karen reached down and tugged on the rope securing the boat. She didn't seem to care that loosening it would send it drifting into the shallow lagoon. She didn't stop to think about the potential damage. All she saw was an opportunity to claim she had caught another violation. Her pattern was predictable. Create chaos, then pretend the chaos proved she was needed. She loosened the knot and stepped back, satisfied. But when the boat didn't drift, she frowned. The narrator notes that she kicked the dock in frustration, unaware that the rope was tied on both ends, a simple trick meant to see how far she would go. Karen then leaned down again, this time determined to remove the second tie. She muttered to herself, puffing with determination. Right as she reached for the rope, the soft click of a motion-activated spotlight snapped across the dock. The sudden brightness exposed her completely. She froze. Her clipboard fell, her flashlight skittered across the wooden planks, her mouth hung open while her eyes darted around, searching for who activated the light. But it wasn't a person. The narrator explains that the motion sensor was timed precisely for this moment. It was positioned so that only someone standing where she stood would trigger it. The rest of the marina remained dimly lit, giving the event a theatrical focus that felt almost staged for an audience. Karen scrambled to collect her things, stumbling against the dock rail. For a moment she looked like she might fall into the water, but she regained balance just enough to stand upright. Under the harsh beam of the spotlight, her attempt at stealth crumbled. Just when she decided to flee, a second light clicked on from another angle, then another. The entire dock lit up like a runway, highlighting every inch of her failed mission. She panicked, convinced someone was watching her, which was true. The narrator describes how she hurried back toward her house, clutching her clipboard like a shield. But before she reached the walkway, she ran into something worse. Neighbors turning their porch lights on one by one, not to confront her, but to watch her. Their silence cut deeper than any words could. It showed they saw everything. It showed she wasn't feared anymore. Karen darted into her home and slammed the door. The neighborhood settled back into quiet. The named character watched the last camera feed go still before saving the footage. This was the beginning. The trap had finally started to close. The start of this chapter continues the story directly from the moment the trap had been set and the lake grew quiet again. The plan rested on timing, patience, and the confidence that Karen's obsession would push her over the edge. Every sign suggested she was studying my property as closely as I was studying her patterns. That made the night feel charged, like a long fuse had already been lit earlier in the day. The first hours after sunset passed without incident. The lake reflected the last traces of color behind the hills and slowly sank into darkness. The water carried almost no wind, turning the whole inlet into a glassy sheet. That made the decoy boat stand out even more, and it made every sound sharper. It felt like the entire shoreline knew something was about to happen. From the upper loft of the cabin, I watched the narrow access road that wound down from the HOA side of the neighborhood. It was barely more than the steep dirt strip, with a few solar lights someone had stuck into the ground years ago. Those lights barely worked, but they were just enough to catch motion when anyone walked by. I'd set my angles so the road was visible without giving away where I was. Hours crawled by. Crickets filled the silence. The dock creaked now and then as water shifted under the planks. Everything felt still, as if the lake held its breath with me. What struck me most was how natural it felt waiting her out. Karen thrived on pushing boundaries, and tonight she thought she'd finally found one she could break without attention. That alone made her predictable. Close to midnight, the first sign appeared. A faint glow of a flashlight flickered between the hills. It wasn't steady. Karen wasn't experienced at nighttime trespassing. The beam waved around, betraying every step she took down the trail. The lake caught the reflection and broke it into moving streaks. She hadn't even reached the dock, but the plan was already working. The beam paused several times, as if she was checking to make sure no one had followed her. The idea that she thought she could hide something this big made the moment almost surreal. Her whole campaign against me had always been loud, public, and dramatic. But this part, the part where she thought she had an advantage, she tried to keep quiet. It showed how desperate she'd become. When she finally reached the bottom of the hill, her flashlight hit the glazed surface of the lake and revealed the decoy boat. She lifted the beam higher as if she needed to reassure herself that she was truly alone. Each step she took down the dock made the planks thump softly, sending little ripples that stretched out under the hull. The boat had been fixed to the dock with a failsafe that would break free as soon as she tried to move it. Not dangerously, just enough to ensure the motion looked like an intentional theft. The old outboard motor's casing was cracked on purpose, making it appear non-functional. Once she climbed on board and pushed away, it would drift exactly where I need it to go. Karen climbed in with more noise than confidence. She stepped wrong, caught her balance, cursed in a way that didn't match her usual polished tone around the HOA board. Then she settled herself near the stern, adjusting her flashlight a final time before trying to release the rope. When she tugged, the knot slipped free faster than she expected, sending her backward into the seat. The boat lurched, nudged away from the dock, and began drifting along the slow current. She didn't realize what she had triggered. The motion sensor I had mounted earlier picked up the movement as soon as the boat left the dock. A silent signal was sent to the system up at the cabin. Another was sent to my phone. And a third, the most important one, activated the small floating marker already waiting in the center of the lake. That marker wasn't visible from shore until the decoy boat drifted past a certain point. Once it did, the hidden lights inside the buoy activated and sent a soft glow across the water like a landing beacon. She kept drifting closer. The calm water pulled her right toward it. She didn't row or steer. She wasn't comfortable enough to take control of the situation. She simply let the shore fade behind her, believing this was an easy win. The buoy's glow spread over the lake, revealing her silhouette clearly. Her posture shifted into a nervous shape as she looked around, unsure why the water had suddenly lit up. Up in the cabin, I stepped outside onto the deck and let the cold air settle around me. The lake, now marked with a soft circle, looked like a stage. The trap wasn't meant to scare her. It was meant to show everything for what it was: a night theft, a violation she had no way to rewrite or dress up. The camera on the bluff captured her every movement in full clarity, and the sensors logged every second. By the time she realized she was drifting toward the middle of the lake with no clear explanation for the lights, it was too late. She tried rowing, but the single oar she found was fixed to the ribs of the boat. She tugged at it several times before giving up. Her frustration carried across the water in small, frantic motions that caused the boat to tip slightly. The lake amplified every gesture. She wasn't stuck, not yet, but she believed she might be, and that was enough to turn her composure into panic. The thing about Karen wasn't that she was fearless. She was used to control. She was used to authority. She wasn't built for uncertainty or open water at night. That alone made the moment powerful to watch. As she drifted directly into the center of the glowing ring, the boat's bottom tapped the underwater guide that stopped her from floating any farther. She tried pushing off with her foot, but the guide held firm. She didn't know it, but she was right where she needed to be. Her head whipped toward the cabin. Her flashlight beam struggled to reach the shoreline. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't break the silence. She sat frozen. That's where the chapter ends, not with the climax, but with the moment the trap fully closed and she realized she wasn't the one in charge anymore.
The morning after the boat vanished from its slip, the community felt different. The air carried a hum of gossip that swirled through cul-de-sacs and around mailboxes. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had answers. And that was exactly how the narrator wanted the day to start. The trap was working even better than expected. What no one realized was that Corinne herself hadn't slept. She'd been pacing across her living room until dawn, rehearsing explanations and adjusting her story to sound like someone who had heroically secured an unregistered marine hazard. She wanted credit. She needed recognition. The entire reason she stole the boat was to prove a point, and now she planned to double down. She printed 3 copies of the HOA rulebook and highlighted sections she thought would justify her late-night stunt, though none of those rules actually applied. Still, she planned to wield those papers like a badge. By sunrise, she rallied her inner circle, a small crew of self-appointed HOA disciples who liked to think of themselves as neighborhood guardians. They called themselves the compliance team, as if the community needed a task force to monitor potted plants and bird feeders. They showed up in matching pastel polo shirts, clipboards in hand, ready to conduct what they called a neighborhood wellness sweep, a phrase they believed sounded official. It only made them look like a group of people with too much free time. Karen led the charge straight toward the narrator's dock. She wanted to make a scene. She wanted to show dominance. She wanted evidence that she was right. Instead, she found the empty space exactly where the boat had been. She froze for a moment, thrown off balance by the sight of the clear water. The boat she thought she had safely hidden wasn't where she expected to find it. She tried not to look startled in front of her followers. Still, she recovered fast. She claimed she moved the boat to a secure location, pretending it was all part of a protocol she had invented in her head. The compliance team nodded along, not because they believed her, but because they feared her. Corinne's version of authority was loud and exhausting, and most people found it easier to nod than argue.
The narrator watched them from the window of the cabin, sipping coffee and preparing for the next phase of the plan. Everything unfolding outside was happening exactly on schedule. The boat's GPS tracker was still quietly uploading its location to a private server. The camera hidden under the rear storage panel had already captured Curran's face during the theft, along with every member of her group cheering her on as she drove away with someone else's property. The narrator wasn't interested in destroying them. The goal was simple: expose them, make them accountable in the most public way possible. Karen gathered her team and decided to expand her sweep. She wanted to check every dock, yard, and fence line. She convinced herself she was doing a service for the community, as if she'd been deputized by someone other than her own ego. They wandered through the neighborhood, pulling out measuring tape, jotting down imaginary violations, and photographing anything they could twist into a complaint. What they didn't notice was how many neighbors were watching them. People peeked from their porches, exchanged looks, and whispered. The mood had shifted. Before this, Karen had been seen as a nuisance, a talkative force of chaos who thrived on small confrontations. Now people sensed something different, something desperate, something sloppy. It didn't take long for frustration to turn into quiet resistance. A few residents followed behind her team, filming everything. Others started texting each other updates, screenshots, photos, speculation. The narrator didn't have to do a thing. Karen was building her own downfall with every exaggerated step she took. And then came the moment that snapped the tension. Karen spotted a small fishing kayak tied up next to a neighbor's dock. She decided it was improperly moored. She barked instructions to her team. She wanted it confiscated. She wanted it removed. She wanted to show that she could take action the same way she had taken the narrator's boat. But when she reached for the kayak rope, she tripped on a coil of chain lying near the dock post. She stumbled forward, losing her balance completely, and splashed into the cold lake water with a sound that echoed across the shoreline. Her followers gasped. Several neighbors burst into laughter. Phones came up, cameras recorded. It was over in seconds, but the embarrassment spread across the community like wildfire. Karen surfaced, sputtering, furious, soaked, and scrambling for dignity she'd never get back. Her team tried to help her out of the water, but they slipped too, causing a ridiculous chain reaction that sent 2 more people tumbling into the lake. It became a full spectacle, the kind of scene no one forgets. And the narrator watched from the balcony, knowing this was the perfect moment to move forward with the plan. While Karen screamed at her team to stop laughing and start enforcing something, anything, the narrator walked calmly toward the shoreline. The crowd parted. People knew something was about to happen. Karen turned, dripping, shivering, furious, and tried to regain control of the story. She accused the narrator of hiding the boat. She accused him of sabotaging the dock. She accused him of setting her up. She didn't realize she was right. But the narrator didn't say a word. Instead, he pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. A projector he had set up earlier flickered to life on the side of the storage shed. The first image appeared: Karen climbing into the boat the night she stole it. The next image, her smiling proudly as she steered it away. Then clips of her team cheering, posing, celebrating what they thought was a victory. The crowd stood still. No one spoke. No one needed to. Karen's face drained of color. She recognized the footage. She recognized the exact angle, the exact lighting. She understood that she had just been caught in front of the entire neighborhood, with no room to deny or spin anything. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound cracked in the air like shattered glass. The narrator stepped back, letting the silence do its work. He didn't accuse her. He didn't confront her. He simply let the truth stand there, undeniable and unedited. Neighbors began to mutter. Some were angry, some were disappointed, some were newly empowered, finally seeing proof of the behavior they had tried to describe for years. Karen looked for support, but her team avoided her eyes. They knew the tide had turned. This was only the beginning of her unraveling, and the narrator knew she would not go down quietly. The trap had been sprung. The fallout was about to begin.
The fallout from Karen's late-night boat rescue mission echoed across the entire marina by sunrise. Every slip owner seemed to have heard a different version of what happened, yet all the stories shared one detail. Karen had been caught red-handed dragging the decoy boat toward the ramp, only to discover it wasn't the prize she expected. She had pulled an old, pre-rigged trap boat designed to expose her interference without risking anything of real value. The cameras caught everything. The alarms caught her panic, and the HOA's so-called executive committee woke up to an inbox buried under messages demanding answers. The scene outside my cabin that morning felt like the start of a storm. People moved in clusters. Some whispered, others recorded videos for their own channels. Karen arrived first with her usual self-important stride, but the sleepless night had left her more frantic than commanding. She tried to stand in front of the damaged decoy boat as if covering it would change the facts. Her closest allies huddled behind her, hoping to salvage the situation by repeating the phrase she had always used when caught doing something she shouldn't. It's a misunderstanding, but the community's patience had drained faster than the tide. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Instead of their usual quiet confidence, there was a tension in their posture that hinted at fear. Losing control of a community they had ruled with rigid rules and selective enforcement terrified them more than the truth itself. Their authority depended on people believing the board kept the peace. Yet now, their most vocal enforcer had become the face of chaos. Karen kept insisting the boat was illegally moored, that she had acted out of responsibility to protect property values. But the more she talked, the more her story unraveled. While the community gathered, I reviewed the footage one more time. It was even clearer than I remembered. Karen creeping across the dock, the chain she tried to loosen, the moment she realized she had triggered the alarm, the frantic scramble that followed. It was all the HOA needed to make a decision, but knowing them, they would still try to twist the situation in their favor. So, I walked into the meeting with a simple goal. I wasn't there to spark a fight. I wanted the truth settled, the harassment to stop, and the community to finally see who had been pulling the strings. The meeting room filled fast. Nearly every resident showed up, drawn by the promise of answers. At the center stood the board and Karen, shifting between anger and panic. For the first time, she didn't look untouchable. She looked cornered. The board chair cleared his throat, preparing to begin, but the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People wanted accountability, and they wanted it now. As I approached, the mood shifted. Camera phones lifted, people leaned forward. They knew I carried something the board couldn't hide. I placed the USB drive on the table. The chair hesitated, glancing at Karen, who shook her head in small, frantic motions. But avoiding it wasn't an option. The community demanded transparency. When the footage appeared on the projector, the room fell silent. Karen's face drained of color. Her supporters stepped back. The board stopped breathing. The video told the truth without a single word from me. It showed her breaking the chain. It showed her dragging the decoy boat toward the ramp. It showed the alarm she triggered. It showed the panic. And above all, it showed her intent. Not to enforce a rule, not to protect the marina, but to punish someone she disliked. When the lights came back on, the room didn't erupt right away. The quiet was heavier than shouting. People exchanged glances that spoke louder than outrage. They had suspected for years that Karen's enforcement had nothing to do with rules. Now they had proof. The board tried to regain control. They whispered among themselves, glancing at the crowd, Karen, and the screen. They made an announcement stating they would review the incident formally. But their attempt to calm the room failed instantly. The residents pushed back. They demanded immediate action. Some referenced past incidents. Others mentioned how long they had tolerated her selective punishments. The room went from quiet tension to a steady swell of frustration. Karen snapped. She accused everyone of betrayal. She claimed she had been the only one willing to protect the neighborhood.
Her voice grew more frantic with each sentence, the confidence cracking in real time. She pointed at me, insisting the whole thing was a setup, but no one supported the accusation. The community had heard enough. The board finally made a decision. They suspended her from all enforcement roles pending investigation. Karen's world cracked open, and the authority she held over the community dissolved in seconds. She stormed out of the room, leaving behind a trail of resentment and the remnants of her influence. Outside, the same people who had once avoided conflict now gathered in small groups, talking freely for the first time. They discussed improving the bylaws, limiting board power, and creating actual transparency. The trap boat did more than catch Karen. It exposed years of quiet frustration. Later that evening, as the sun settled behind the marina, I checked my real boat. Still untouched, still safe. The decoy sat at the dock like a symbol of everything that had happened. The board emailed a formal apology hours later, promising corrective action and a full review of enforcement practices. For the first time since moving here, the community felt united. But I knew the story wasn't over. Someone had tipped Karen off earlier that week. Someone who wanted trouble. And as the day ended, a quiet suspicion settled. The real challenge wasn't exposing her. It was finding out who had worked behind the scenes, feeding her information and pushing her to conflict. That shadow in the background wasn't gone. It was waiting. The break between chapters formed naturally as the calm before the next storm arrived. The fallout from Karen's staged rescue never cooled down. If anything, the neighborhood shifted into a strange tension, the kind that settled under the surface like a brewing storm. Everyone had seen the footage. Everyone had heard the rumors, and everyone was whispering the same thing. The boat she rescued wasn't what she thought it was. Yet Karen refused to back down. Instead, she doubled her efforts, convinced she could twist the narrative before everything slipped out of her hands. That week became a slow crawl of HOA theatrics. She started dragging clipboards to every corner of the lakeside. She marched up and down the docks, performing inspections no one asked for. She snapped photos of shadows, footprints, and reflections on water, as though she were gathering evidence for a major federal case, rather than trying to rewrite a story she had already lost. The board members followed her around with worn-out patience, trying to keep up, and trying even harder not to look like they regretted ever supporting her. While the neighborhood watched this circus unfold, I kept my routine. I let her spiral. I let her gather fake reports and stage over-the-top safety warnings, because the truth was already locked in place. The trap had been set the moment she touched the boat. She just hadn't reached the final step yet. Every morning, the lake sat calm and bright, a perfect reflection of the mountains. And every morning, Karen stormed past the shoreline like she had something to prove. I saw the weight of it in her movements. She wanted control back. She wanted authority. But most of all, she wanted to undo the embarrassment that still followed her like a shadow. Neighbors who previously avoided conflict now watched openly. They sat on porch steps. They lingered at the community bulletin board. They murmured about the growing divide inside the HOA. Some called it entertaining, others called it exhausting. But everyone agreed on one thing. Something big was coming. Karen reached her breaking point on a windy afternoon when the lake kicked up waves that slapped hard against the docks. She called an emergency HOA meeting right on the water, insisting the boat situation had become a neighborhood threat. Her voice echoed through the air as she lined up her supporters and tried to drum up panic again. She pointed at my slip like it was a crime scene. She waved around binders. She talked about code violations that didn't exist and safety hazards she invented. But this time, the board didn't respond with applause or nods of approval. Instead, they exchanged uneasy looks. They shuffled their papers. They shifted their weight. They tried to keep the peace, but the strain showed. They had been part of her crusade, But something about this new obsession made them rethink where they stood. Then the wind picked up and the docks groaned. One of the board members muttered that they should continue the meeting indoors. Karen snapped back that the lake was proof of danger and staying outside was essential. Her determination overruled practicality. Even her closest allies hesitated, but she waved them toward the end of the dock as if expecting them to follow her into battle. This was the moment I had been waiting for, because the trap wasn't about the fake boat. It wasn't about catching her in a single lie. It was about exposure, showing the neighborhood the truth in a way that couldn't be twisted or hidden. So I walked over with the folder I'd been saving. It held dates, signatures, archived emails, and most importantly, the HOA's own liability revisions that Karen conveniently ignored during her crusade. The timing was perfect. A gust of wind hit just as the meeting reached peak tension. Papers scattered, people reached to grab them, Karen barked orders over the noise, and in the middle of that chaos, I placed the folder on the nearest table and let the board open it themselves. The truth quieted the entire dock. Even the lake seemed to settle as the board members read page after page, their expression shifting from confusion to dread. They finally understood. Karen hadn't just made a mistake, she had triggered a legal nightmare for the HOA. Her unauthorized boat seizure attempt, her false safety filings, her self-proclaimed emergency actions, and her exaggerated lake reports, all of it fell directly on the board unless they distanced themselves fast. The wind pressed against us again, shaking the dock and rattling the posts. Karen tried to grab the folder, desperate to stop them from reading any further, but the board stepped back. They didn't want her touching anything else. That quiet rejection seemed to hit her harder than any argument could have. The neighborhood watched from yards and patios as the meeting dissolved into a tense, whisper-filled circle. The board members leaned over the documents, each one looking more uneasy by the second. Karen's confidence cracked. She paced, she muttered, she pointed at me as though that could somehow erase the evidence. But nothing could change the fact that she had crossed lines even the HOA couldn't defend. When they finally lifted their heads, the board made a decision that spread across the docks like a spark catching dry grass. They announced a vote right then, right there, regarding Karen's position, her access to HOA authority, and her actions leading up to the report. They didn't need discussion. They didn't need debate. They had everything they needed in their hands. Karen froze. This wasn't the ending she expected. She thought I'd argue. She thought I'd push back. She thought I wanted humiliation or revenge. But I let the process unfold without a word. I simply stood there, letting the board come to their own conclusion, letting the lake breeze carry away the last pieces of her old authority. The neighborhood watched the vote. Heads lifted, eyes widened. And the result became the shift that broke the tension that had been building for weeks. The board revoked Karen's enforcement privileges. They stripped her of her ability to conduct inspections, and they removed her from all HOA field authority until a full review could be completed. Karen stood on the dock, wind pressing her clothes tight against her frame, hair whipping across her face, holding on to the last threads of her power while they slipped through her fingers like water. The trap had finally closed, and she still had no idea the biggest reveal was yet to come.
The night had barely ended by the time the lakefront neighborhood realized something strange was happening near the marina. Word spread fast that HOA Karen had taken the boat she believed she was confiscating on behalf of her board, and the news traveled even faster when people heard she had sailed directly into a carefully prepared trap. As the early morning mist rolled across the lake, the first neighbors stepped out onto their porches to witness the aftermath. The scene was impossible to ignore. Karen's self-appointed patrol group stood along the shore, staring at the water with stunned disbelief as her borrowed arrogance bobbed helplessly in the middle of the lake. The boat sat anchored exactly where it had been designed to stop. The chain beneath it, hidden the night before, held the hull firmly in place, leaving her stranded
until someone with the right tools came to retrieve her. The community watched from every angle. Phones were out, cameras zoomed in. Even those who had remained neutral until now couldn't help but acknowledge that the spectacle had reached a point beyond the usual HOA drama. Every resident saw how the board's behavior had spiraled and how far Karen had carried her obsession. She had turned a petty dispute into a lake-wide embarrassment. The board members who had supported her plan stood in a tight line, unsure whether to help, apologize, or pretend they had nothing to do with her antics. Their faces betrayed their indecision. Some looked ashamed, others looked quietly afraid of what would come next. No one looked confident. Meanwhile, Karen paced back and forth on the deck of the immobilized boat, waving her arms in frantic circles, as though she still believed she could control the situation. Even from a distance, everyone could tell she was trying to blame anyone but herself. But the lake was calm. No one was shouting back. No one was defending her. Instead, they watched the very trap she had triggered, a trap built by the homeowner who had predicted her next step down to the smallest detail. Back on shore, the boat's real owner stood quietly near the boat launch. There was no triumph in his face, only a sense of completion. The trap had not been created to humiliate her, but to prove a point. She had taken the boat believing she had authority. She had assumed the lake was under her control. She had acted as though the rights of homeowners could be overridden by personal feelings. The moment she set sail, she surrendered all claims of innocence. Now she was suspended in the middle of the lake as the sun rose, caught like a trophy of her own creation. The sheriff's boat finally arrived, slicing through the morning fog with steady purpose. Deputies approached slowly, likely trying to understand why so many neighbors lined the shore with their phones out. They had been briefed about the boat theft, but had not expected to find the thief trapped and spinning on an anchored vessel. The deputies tied off at the stern and climbed aboard. The spectators couldn't hear the conversation, but they didn't need the words to know how the deputies felt. Their posture said everything. Karen's posture, on the other hand, showed that her confidence had evaporated. Her arms folded tightly, her shoulders slumped. She didn't demand control of anything. She didn't point fingers. She simply sank into a chair on the deck, shrinking as the deputies documented the scene. When they finally returned to shore, the crowd parted instinctively. The same people she had lectured, threatened, and reported stepped aside and let her pass. No one confronted her. No one taunted her. Their silence was louder than any insult. The deputies asked the boat's owner to walk them through how the trap had been set. He explained it plainly. The lake was privately owned. The dock was legally his. The chain was placed beneath the water for maintenance security. The trap had activated only because she had taken the boat without permission. That was all. Nothing more, nothing less. The deputies nodded, understanding exactly what had happened. The law had been broken, but the trap itself was not against any regulation. The HOA had no jurisdiction on privately owned lake property. The board members shifted nervously as they listened, each realization stacking on top of the last. Their assumptions, their policies, their threats, none of it held weight outside of the land they governed. They had stepped beyond their limits, and now everyone knew. Karen was escorted away in the back of a patrol car. She wasn't arrested, but the conversation she faced at the station would not be pleasant. The board members who had supported her plan disappeared quickly after, scattering like birds startled from a wire. Their unity dissolved the moment accountability appeared. Throughout the day, the lakefront buzzed with new energy. Neighbors talked openly about how the HOA had overstepped, how far things had escalated, and how absurd the situation had become. Conversations that had once been whispered in corners now happened in plain sight. The atmosphere shifted toward change. By evening, a neighborhood meeting was scheduled, not by the HOA board, but by the homeowners themselves. Dozens attended, including many who had never bothered before. The board was forced to sit at the center, listening as residents demanded transparency, boundaries, and a full review of their powers. The boat incident was mentioned repeatedly. Every resident agreed that such behavior could not continue. Karen's seat remained empty. By the time the sun set, the meeting concluded with a decision that sent a ripple across the entire community. A formal vote would be held. Board members could either accept new limits or face removal. All future enforcement actions would require full documentation and homeowner approval. And no member, no matter their title, would have the power to seize personal property on behalf of the association. The lake returned to silence as the crowd dispersed. The boat was back in its slip, the chain was removed, and for the first time in months, the owner of the boat felt a sense of peace wash across the water. The trap had worked, not to punish, not to hurt, but to reveal the truth. And in the end, that truth changed everything.